traditions, in addition to college football and NASCAR. But Birmingham, in particular, since you all are from all over the country and visiting with us maybe for the first time, one of the richest traditions that we have in Alabama and in the Birmingham area is the African American a cappella gospel. And there is no group that represents this tradition better than the Birmingham Sunlights. This group has represented the state of Alabama in a number of cultural exchange endeavors. Italy, we had a good time in Italy with you guys, and France. They've been in Australia. They've performed with Garrison Keillor. They've been National Folk Festival. They've been all over. But when we want to put our best foot forward and when we want to musically show off a little bit, it's a real joy for us to be able to share with you and folks from other parts of the country the Birmingham Sunlights. So we're going to start a little bit early with them. We wish we had a longer period of time, but we've got enough time to give you a really good flavor of what these guys do and a really strong tradition here in Birmingham in the state of Alabama. So guys, let me let you take it away.
We are a traditional Southern gospel group. And one thing about traditions, we always pass that down from generation to generation. Now, my great-great-grandfather was a preacher, he had a quartet. My grandfather sang a quartet with his brother. My father sang a quartet. We have a quartet. And the generation behind us is Grandma, Barry's son. So he's on a quartet. And then we have our sons and grandsons. The sons of the Sunlights, they have a quartet as well. So there are many generations of quartets in our family. Well, hallelujah, hallelujah. Now I've been going ever since I made a start, days are brighter. Hallelujah, make my burden lighter. Jesus' love just bubbles over in my heart, in my heart. Well, hallelujah. Days are brighter. Hallelujah. Make my burden lighter. Jesus' love just bubbles over in my heart, in my heart. Well, now when I get to heaven, sing and take my Jesus. Love just bubbles over in my heart, in my heart. You know, 3 tall angels is gonna toll that mighty big hill. Love just bubbles over in my heart, in my heart. Well, hallelujah. I've been going ever since I made a start, days are brighter. song, and then I'm going to invite SOS, the Sons of the Sunlight, to come in and give us a sample of what they'll learn. No, as a matter of fact, I think I'll do that. This time I want to call on Steve. Jesus will pick you up.
If he has to reach way down, Jesus will pick you up. If the Lord to way down, Jesus will pick you up. If the Lord has to reach way down, Jesus will pick you up. Jesus will pick you up. If he has to reach way down, if he has to reach way down, my Jesus will pick you up. If the Lord is to reach you can't sing the way you used to, it's 'cause you're doing the same old thing. That's enough to with the history way. My Jesus, Jesus will pick you up. Give my Lord us to rain down, way down. Jesus will pick you up. If my Lord has to rain down, way down. Jesus will pick you up. Jesus will pick you up. Every way down. Listen, if you're in the pulpit, preaching so low, preaching for the money but not caring for the soul. If you can't reach my brother the way you used to, it's 'cause you're doing the same old thing. That's it, I'll do if he has to reach away down with Jesus. Jesus will pick you up. If my Lord is to rain down, way down. Jesus will pick you up. If my Lord has to rain down, way down. Jesus will pick you up. My Jesus, Jesus will pick you up. If your past do with your fancy clothes won't let you stay, man. If your diamond rings and your designer shoes won't let you pat your feet and clap your hands. If you can't praise him the way you used to, it's 'cause you're doing the same old thing. That's it, I'll do if he has to reach away. My Jesus, Jesus will pick you up. If my Lord has to rain down, way down. Jesus will pick you up. If my Lord has to rain, Jesus will pick you up. My Jesus, Jesus will pick you up. If he has to reach way down, if he has to reach way down, if my Lord has to reach way down, you touch your mind, get in your heart, touch your soul, make everything alright. I wanna let you know, I just wanna let you know, good God Almighty, gotta let you know, Jesus will pick you up, can't nobody do it.
back in time just a little bit. We're going to go back to the 1800s. A song entitled, It's Gonna Rain. Now notice we have quite a few youngsters here today. You know, I remember when I was referred to as a youngster. Now, they call me.
She called me.
But what we're going to do, this is a rap song. We're going to do the very first verse in that old traditional rap. Because rap music is well over 135 years old. We're going to do the very first verse of the old traditional rap. And we'll do the second verse in the new 1980.
Well, said it's gonna rain till the God's gonna send the water from Zion. Lord, it's gonna rain, the heavens up higher. It's gonna rain, it's gonna rain. It's gonna rain till the God's gonna send the water from Zion. Lord, it's gonna rain, the heavens up higher. It's gonna rain, it's gonna rain.
God got angry upon his throne. The angels up in heaven, they began to moan. He said, go down, angels, stir up the blood. Blood out the blood. They come back, angels, and Bob was doom. I declare my time, shall get on. The tell the great God when it started to rain. From where it ever should, they began to spring. Knocked on the window, they battered on the door, said, look, I hear Noah, can you take on? But Noah said, I'm sorry, my friend, but God's got to keep you. Can't you hear it? But hey, God's gonna send the Lord from Zion. He gonna bring the heavens up higher. It's gonna rain. It's gonna rain. It's gonna rain till God's gonna send the Lord from Zion. He gonna bring the heavens up higher. It's gonna rain. It's gonna rain. Now wait a minute. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights without stopping. Noah got worried when the rain kept dropping. The wind didn't blow and the ark didn't rock. Broke low, he couldn't find nowhere to stop. So he sent out a raven, he sent out a dove, but the water great God kept on coming from above. God spoke to Noah, he whispered low, he said, look ahead, Lord, let me tell you where to go. I want you to land on a mountain top, just as soon as my heavenly waters stop. Then God showed Noah the rainbow sign, said it won't be water, but fire next time.
Rain till the God's gonna send the water from Zion. Rain till the heavens up higher. It's gonna rain. It's gonna rain.
It's gonna
Rain. Children, there won't be water. There won't be water. No, 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 no.
There won't be water, my dear sisters and brothers.
But it's gonna be fire. Time.
Thank you. Thank you. For our next song, we want to step back in time. This song has 3 parts. The very first part of this song is a 1880s, 1890s arrangement. The second part of the song is the 1940s arrangement. And the third part of the song is the new millennium.
Go and get Daniel. Oh, Daniel. To come and read the hand. That was the writing. Oh, the whoa, whoa, oh. Well, there's a handwriting on the wall. On the wall. Yes, there's a handwriting on the wall. Oh, Lord, it's writing on the wall. There's a handwriting on the wall. On the wall. Yes, there's a handwriting on the wall. Oh, Lord, it's writing on the wall. Well, if you read the Bible, then you read it well. You know the story about the ten chapters sitting in the bank of gold. Drinking from the vessel of his love God. You come on down to the banquet hall. There's his right there on the wall. Come on down, saw the handwriting, right there on the wall. Yes, there's the handwriting on the wall. There's the handwriting on the wall. There's the handwriting on the wall. Hey, oh, Lord, it's writing on the wall. Yes, there's the handwriting on the wall. Handwriting on the wall. Yes, there's the handwriting on the wall. Hey, oh, Lord, it's writing on the wall. Well, if you read your Bible and you read it well, you know the story that I'm about to tell. Well, the chapter was sitting at the banquet board, drinking from the vessel of his love God. Tell me that his eyes was red with wine when God come a jumping on the wheels of time. He come on down to the banquet hall and set his hand right there on the wall. Yes, there's the handwriting on the wall. There's the handwriting on the wall. Yes, there's the handwriting on the wall. Oh, Lord, it's writing on the wall. Yes, there's the handwriting on the wall. On the wall. Yes, there's the handwriting on the wall. Oh, Lord, it's writing on the wall. Thank you.
Well, join us a little bit late. You've been enjoying the Birmingham Sunlights 2009 National Endowment for the Arts National Heritage Award winners. Birmingham Sunlights, we love you and we're proud that you can be here.
What a beginning. What a beginning. We are so grateful to the Birmingham Sunlights. We're so grateful to the board and staff of the Alabama Humanities Council for making it possible to begin our proceedings in this beautiful, beautiful place with such an inspiring start. But that's not all we have to thank the Alabama staff and board for. They have been incredible throughout the planning process. You're going to find them to be incredible throughout all of our activities for these next few days, and we are so, so grateful to you all. I would like to welcome all of you to the 2013 National Humanities Conference. We are so glad you're here. I know that at this moment, you are also so glad you're here. And I know that's going to keep up for all of the rest of our time together. We really appreciate having you. I would like to make some very quick introductions of some important members of the Federation community. I would first like to introduce the Federation board members, and then I'd like to introduce the Federation staff. So when I say the board members' names, I wish that you would stand and remain standing, and same for the staff members. And this is so that all of you know, if you have any questions or concerns or complaints or anything throughout the next couple of days, you know the people to go to. John Roth is the chair of the Federation board. He comes from Washington State. David Colburn is the immediate past chair of the Federation board. Roger Bloomberg is vice chair. He's from Rhode Island. Ann Thompson, our secretary, is the director of the Oklahoma Humanities Council. You'll be hearing from Ann in a moment. Kate Stevenson, the treasurer, is from the Tennessee Council. Rick Ardinger, head of our legislative committee, Idaho. Christina Barr, holding Sophie somewhere. Christina is the director of the Nevada Humanities Council. Bob Brink from Virginia. Judy Bynum is from South Carolina. There's Judy. Juan Gonzalez-Lamela, Puerto Rico. Eric Jorgensen from Maine. Julie Mulvihill, Kansas. Peter Torkelson, Massachusetts. Christina Velitis, Illinois. Willis Witchard, North Carolina, and could not be with us today, Jarrett Fields from Wisconsin. Thank you all. These are a hardworking group, and as you see, from all over the country. Thank you. The members of the Federation staff, of whom I am incredibly proud: Jeff Allen, Vice President. I think there's Jeff. Elizabeth Payne, Director of Finance, all the way at the back. Shannon Loberg, Director of Meetings and Events, and responsible for a lot of stuff. And Natalie Pack, who is our Director of Communications, also. Thank you so much. Thank you again for being here. Thanks again to the Alabama Council Board. And I would like to introduce Ann Thompson, who is the chair of this year's remarkable planning committee.
Well, welcome. Welcome on behalf of this year's conference committee. We began meeting here in Birmingham almost 2 years ago. It's been a great opportunity to work with colleagues from around the country and to get to know the members of our host council, Alabama. Esther and her staff, especially Shannon Loberg, have made this process just a real pleasure. I'd like to ask the members of the committee to please stand. This is your planning committee for the conference here. When I read your names, please. Phoebe Stein from Maryland. Randy Akers, South Carolina. Michael Chambers, Washington, D.C. Brenda Thompson, Arizona. Karen Wickender, Nevada. And from Alabama, Armand de Kaiser, Gwen Robinson, John Rochester, and Afina Ward. Thank you all for your help. We are so fortunate to be in Birmingham at this time to commemorate and remember events of the past, especially the year 1963. Some of these events show hatred and ignorance and cowardice. Others demonstrate the better angels of our nature. This year's conference theme is Lifting Us Up, Reflection, Reconciliation, and Renewal. It's been said that, but for Birmingham, our nation would look different today. We still have a long way to go. State humanities councils have a role to play here, as we have for the past 40 years. We are the memory keepers and the storytellers. Despite our occasional detractors and other challenges, remember that our work matters. We hope that the next 2 days inspire you and remind you that the work of the State Humanities Council truly changes lives and lifts us up. Thank you.
I assure you I'll be very brief. I'm Armand de Kaiser, Executive Director of the Alabama Humanities Foundation, and I too want to thank you to my hometown here in Birmingham. We are glad that you're here. This is going to be a fabulous panel. I'm so excited to hear this. But what I want to do is do one thing, just one little thing. You've probably heard this before, but if you have a cell phone, we'd like you to turn it off. If you don't want any buzzings or anything like that, if you can do that, we'd appreciate that. The other last thing I will say is that it's always great to be an executive director when you have a strong board and a strong team behind you. Here in Alabama, we do. Our board has been fabulous, they've been supportive, they've been involved. There's a number of them here, and I don't want to list all of them, but I just want to thank all of them for my personal thanks, and our staff. Staff's all around here, and we appreciate everything that they have done, and we thank you for coming. With that, as I said, we have a strong chair to John Rochester, and he's going to take us over and lead us from here.
Thank you, Art. It's really, the only thing I'm going to do is introduce the Reverend Arthur Price, and I meant to ask you if we can clap in church, Reverend Price, but I think it's too late. I think we removed the sunlights were fantastic, and Al Head, we appreciate you doing that, a member of our board. But he got them together for us, but they're a tribute to Birmingham. And at this time, I do want to introduce the Reverend Arthur Price, who is the senior pastor at this historic and sacred place. Of course, you know the congregation's history. You know that for the past 50 years, they are a testament to what forgiveness can be through the intentional, vile evil that was perpetrated on not only this house, but their precious children. They have somehow come around, and instead of vengeance and anger and hate, they've given back forgiveness and a prayer for justice. And so at this time, I'm going to ask Reverend Price if you would come and ask for a blessing for this gathering. Reverend Arthur Price.
We'll let us bow for a word of prayer. Eternal God, our Father, we're so grateful and so thankful to be able to gather in this place. Thank you for this Humanities conference that has assembled here today to continue to talk about the atrocities that many people still have to face, even in this 2013 year. Lord, you have brought us from such a mighty long way. You brought us from segregation. You brought us from boycotts and bombings. You brought us from slavery. You brought us from wars. And God, we know that you did not bring us this far to leave us now. Now, God, we pray that on this day, that those who are gathered will be enlightened, they will be empowered, they will be encouraged, and they will be inspired to continue to fight the good fight of faith. Now, Lord, we just ask for your choicest blessings on this gathering. It's in Jesus' name we pray and give thanks. Amen. Amen.
Good morning. I'm Gwen Robinson, and it is my distinct honor to serve as Vice Chair of the Alabama Humanities Council, and on behalf of the Council as Chair of the event from our perspective. So again, let me too offer my welcome to Birmingham and to Alabama. I was with many of you yesterday on the tour. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was meaningful. Thank you. We enjoyed hosting. It is also my honor today to introduce the MC. If you look at the biographical sketches, and I know being good representatives of the humanities, you've read them beginning to end. I know you. I know your type. I am one of you. But bios often do not do justice to those who are speaking, and this one certainly doesn't to Odessa Woolfolk. I can already tell you that the moderator is already upset with me because she doesn't like long introductions, because she wants to get to what this is really about, and that's the panel. But Odessa, you're going to get a little bit of one today anyway. Odessa Woolfolk is my friend, but more importantly, she is a friend to... So far. You laugh? She means it. She is also a great friend to her native Birmingham, but to Alabama, and I dare say to the nation.
What this bio doesn't tell you, and it certainly tells you that she was an educator and a civil rights activist and a founder, co-founder with others of Leadership Birmingham, and serves on boards and committees throughout the country, and her name is on many awards throughout the state and beyond. But what it doesn't tell you that in 1979, Birmingham elected its first African-American mayor, Dr. Richard Arrington, Dick Arrington, who has been a member of the council and had done some wonderful things in our community. Soon thereafter, Dr. Arrington felt that it was time for our community and our state, and again, I say beyond, to come together and acknowledge what happened here. And he and others had the idea of the Civil Rights Institute, which is across the street, and I hope you will all visit before you leave. If you have any time, and you will, you need to visit. But the community, the business community, I would even say some in the African American community and others said it's not the right time, and we can't build such a facility now and maybe never. Dr. Arrington wasn't used to know, and certainly Odessa Woolfolk was not used. He turned to her, what some might think was not the most logical choice in 1979 for the first African American to turn to Odessa, but it was the perfect choice. She brought together this community and the state to build the Civil Rights Institute that you see today. No one else could have done it. But for Odessa, there would be no Civil Rights Institute. Many others helped, and there was great leadership by Dr. Arrington. But she was the catalyst. She was what we call the spark plug. So she is forever cemented as part of her legacy. CEOs sat down with her. Grassroots organizations sat down with her. All elected officials court her. And she's the only person I know in our state that only goes by one word. All you need to say is Odessa. Odessa.
What can I say? Okay, Gwen, we'll have lunch. I want to sincerely welcome you as you have been welcomed to our town, a place that, for all of its warts, we're proud of it. It's been called the city of perpetual promise, and I guess, Judge, we still are that. Your chair talked about, used the phrase, the better angels of our nature. So I think the panelists represent the better angels of our nature. I'll just say a few brief words. I certainly want to echo the invitation for you to visit the sites that are identified with this period in history. This district is called a Civil Rights District. You will notice when you walk around town that there are a lot of signs marking significant places where marches and protests and boycotts and sit-ins and arrests and so on occur. Our city leadership has done a good job of using this year to commemorate looking backward but looking forward. So we hope you will enjoy that. I think your title, Reflection, Reconciliation, Renewal, is certainly resonant with all of us here, because that's how we think of those events of so long ago. But you know, what happened in Birmingham didn't stay in Birmingham. And that's a good thing. The successful challenge to racism and bigotry resonated in state houses, in the Oval Office of the White House, in the Congress, in the world. What happened here influenced demonstrations of all kinds for civil and human rights, and they still continue. The women's movement certainly was influenced by what happened here. The peace movement, all sorts of good causes. So we're glad you're here, because you also prove that what happened in Birmingham didn't stay in Birmingham. now to why I'm really here. You're fortunate, I consider myself fortunate to sit with these four people. They have inspiring stories and unique perspectives on a moment that is etched forever in memory. Their stories are compelling. Their brief bios in your program, as Gwen has suggested, they can come nowhere near to depicting, describing, telling what these four individuals have done. So what we're going to do is to ask each of them to tell his or her part of that story. Now the challenge is kind because they really ought to take many, many hours to tell the full story. But as moderator, I have suggested to them that they not do that. Because after all, we want to leave some time for your questions, and Gwen has suggested that he will moderate, or I will moderate that, I think you said, Gwen, but you will be called on to go to the mic and so on. But let's get to them first. Let me just say a little something about each of them. Our first speaker, Judge U.W. Clement, was appointed by President Carter as Alabama's first federal judge, and he was a tough judge, but he was a fair judge. One of the stories that I always like to hear Judge talk about is how he decided to be a civil rights lawyer at the young age of 13. And I'm sure he'll talk to you about that and about his civil rights work when he was a college student and a young lawyer. Our second presenter is also a judge on a local level, Judge Helen Shores Lee, the daughter of Arthur Shores, who at one time was Alabama's only practicing African-American lawyer. Her family endured harassment and violence because of his civil rights work. She and her sister wrote a moving book depicting his involvement and the consequences to them and others, and she'll talk about that. Third, think Sunday morning, September 15th, and we here remember that. Man, you weren't old enough. Some of us remember, put it that way. Doug Jones, a young U.S. attorney, succeeded in prosecuting, bringing to justice the KKK villains who for so long had gotten away with murder. Literally. He'll tell you about that. And our final speaker, as I say, last but not least, is Diane McWhorter. You've seen her, you've read her stories, and I hope you've read her book. She's a brilliant and prolific journalist from right here in Birmingham, Alabama. She became an authority on the movement for a very personal reason, and I hope she'll share that story. She wrote a New York Times commentary in January that was called Good and Evil in Birmingham. Maybe she'll give us a dose of both. So that's the lineup. Give the panelists your attention, save your questions, and let's go at it. Judge.
Thank you, Odessa. My brothers and sisters, I'm a product of a segregated society. In fact, when I was born and up until the time that I entered college, Birmingham was popularly thought of as the most thoroughly segregated big city in the nation. It was basically a society where outlawry reigned. When I was 13 years old, 1956, my brother, friend, and I were
walking on a road near U.S. Steel, and were intercepted by two police officers from Fairfield, a suburb of Birmingham, headquarters of U.S. Steel, the state's largest employer. The police car stopped. One of the policemen pointed at one of us, and the fickle finger of fate was at our friend Anthony. And he told him, "Nigga, get in the car." Anthony got in the car. They drove off, came back a few minutes later, pushed Anthony out of the car, and we noticed that the front part of Anthony's pants were wet. And he told us that these officers had put a gun to his head and made him urinate on himself for their amusement. And that was the Damascus Road experience in my life, and what led me to become ultimately a civil rights lawyer. I entered Miles College in December of 1962. At that time, the students, through the student government president, were engaged in planning for a boycott of the Birmingham downtown stores. And the boycott was aimed at the fact that the stores daily offended the dignity of black patrons. And if there were water fountains for blacks, they were separated. If there were restrooms for blacks, they were separate and inferior. You couldn't eat at the lunch counters. You couldn't even try on clothes in the store before you bought them, because the white patrons wouldn't want to buy clothes that had been worn by blacks. And so the students decided to take on the system. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, long time and well-tested leader of the city, had decided some months earlier to move to Cincinnati, although he came back to Birmingham on Monday night for the mass meetings. Mass meetings were about 10 or 15 people. But the students started that campaign, worked it out with the new college president, Lucius Pitts, who was as much of a civil rights activist as I have ever known. He encouraged the students to be involved. And so we would have chapel programs mandatory in those days, and we'd talk about civil rights and what we were going to do as students, and we did it. We went out in the community, talked to black folks at churches, on the downtown streets, and encouraged them not to buy from these stores that offended their dignity. And the movement was so successful that in the week leading up to Easter of 1962, the Wall Street Journal reported that sales in the downtown stores were down by 40%. It got national attention. The Newsweek described us as a broken down Negro college on the western outskirts of Birmingham. But Martin Luther King's group had coordinated with our effort, and so that movement resulted ultimately in the SCLC coming to Birmingham in September of '62, making the decision to come back in the spring of '63 for the demonstrations. In the meantime, the students had gathered a petition asking that the segregation ordinances be rescinded by Bull Connor's city commission. And it just happened that I was the one elected to present the petition. Bull Connor asked me where I lived, and I said Westfield, which was a suburb of Birmingham. And he told me to sit down. I couldn't present the petition because I was an outside agitator. And that I needed to be out of town by sundown, and I was.
when the demonstrations came, we participated. This church, designed and built by black people, was the center of the activities. I remember on one occasion being directed to visit the department store to taste white water and having a gun put to my back and marched out of the store. On that occasion, being sent to the Birmingham Public Library to desegregate it, it happened that the adult chaperone, I was 19 at the time, the adult chaperone looked white, and so the police didn't arrest her. They took pictures, one of which I have today. But the next black group that went down the next day was promptly arrested. I was not arrested during my many days of participation in the movement, probably because that would have had some bearing when I later applied to be a lawyer. The demonstrations, you know, were what they were, led to the March on Washington, led to the bombing here in September of '63, led to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which became effective in '65. And at that time, we tested that law on July 2nd, going around to stores throughout the area to bring a little color into the city. I finished law school, Columbia, in '68, came back, and we had to implement the civil rights laws. And they had to be implemented one lawsuit at a time. The schools were still basically segregated, jobs were still segregated, and we had to bring one lawsuit after another to challenge all of that, which led to the desegregation of schools at the end of the first semester, 1969-70 school year. That's 6 years after the demonstrations. We had litigation against U.S. Steel, then the state's largest employer, which led to a nationwide consent decree that covered the 9 largest steel makers in the nation. There was all kinds of litigation against the personnel board to get blacks employed as firemen and policemen. That lawsuit is still going on today, one of the longest running lawsuits in the country. So those are my reflections. There'll be time for questions, but it's been a real joy being a part of the movement. And like the song said earlier this morning, I've been running ever since I started.
Growing up for me as a young child here in Birmingham, Alabama, was a very turbulent time. It was turbulent for me because of my dad's involvement in many of the civil rights cases. He was handling what I call civil rights cases long before the terms civil rights became popular. For a period of from 1937 to 1970, he was part of all of the principal litigation involving equal rights, not only in this state, but in the Southeast. In 1938, he filed suit to require the Board of Registrars to register 7 black school teachers who had been denied the right to register to vote, and the courts ruled in his favor. In 1941, he argued all the way to the United States Supreme Court in a case called Festus versus L&N Railroad. He argued all the way to the Supreme Court that a white-only railroad union could not deny blacks membership and then not give them a job because they were not members of the union. And he won that case. In 1942, he filed suit on behalf of a black school principal to equalize salary rates among blacks and whites. It only took the Jefferson County Board of Education 4 years to comply with that order, and not until after many, many motions of contempt did they finally comply with the order. In 1948, he represented Senator Glenn Taylor, senator from Idaho, who was arrested here in Birmingham for drinking out of a colored-only water fountain. In 1950, he filed suit here in Birmingham to have the zoning ordinances declared unconstitutional. If you were black living in Birmingham during the late 40s and 50s, you could only live on the east side of a street we called Center Street, which was the dividing line of the city. Blacks lived to the left of Center Street, whites lived to the right of Center Street. He represented a lady by the name of Mary Monk Means, who had purchased a lot on the left side of Center Street and had built a home. But the city would not give her a certificate of occupancy. My dad filed suit, and the day that Judge Mullins brought down the decree declaring the ordinance unconstitutional, her house was dynamited to the ground. People often wonder how Dynamite Hill got its name. During the 50s, late 40s, and 50s, there were some 50 to 60 unsolved bombings of blacks' homes in that area. None of the perpetrators were ever brought to trial. Out of a lot of the cases that he handled, perhaps the most famous was his case of the University of Alabama, Arthur Reed Lucy versus the Board of Trustees at the University of Alabama. Because this was a case that ended the die-hard resistance to integration at the University of Alabama. And even though the law had declared Miss Lucy's right to enter the university, she was expelled. Such rioting took place on campus that she couldn't attend campus. And it was really not until 1963 when my dad, along with attorney Fred Gray, represented Vivian Malone and James Hood, that the university was truly integrated. This is the time that Governor Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door and made his infamous speech. And after he finished, he was asked to step aside. And Miss Hood and Miss Malone and James Hood were allowed to enter the university. It was also in 1963, the infamous year of the Civil Rights Movement, that he filed suit to have the arrest of the school children that had been arrested for marching declared unconstitutional. Well, as I said, all of this and these cases often made my dad a target of the Klan and our family. It was commonplace to have gunshots through the window every other night. In fact, gunshots through the window were so frequent that my dad put a contractor on retainer just in case. We had a routine that we followed as shots would go through the window. We hit the floor and crawled to the safest place. It was also in 1963 that our home was bombed. The newspaper reported that no one was injured in that bombing, so they came back 2 weeks later and they bombed the other end of the house. There was a third attempt to bomb our home, but my mother found the green box of dynamite in the yard before it was to go off. So growing up and the restrictions that were placed on my life as a young person and a teenager made me very upset, and I was very rebellious, and I was very, you might say, a very angry child. If you told me I couldn't do something, I was going to show you, oh yes I could. And I can recall Judge going down to Lover's department store. I always wanted to drink from that white Colonial water fountain. And when I went up to take a drink, a long drink, I was snatched up and thrown to the floor and told I knew better than to be drinking from that water fountain. Well, I didn't stop there. On the streetcars, the sections between black and white were separated by a board. It's red on one side, colored, and the other side, white. Well, you would pay your money up front as a black, and you would walk to the back to get on the bus. Oftentimes, my mother and I would get on the bus, and there would be no place for us to sit. But there would be plenty of seats up front because there would be nobody sitting there, but this was in the white section. So I would merely go move the board up and I could sit there. Every time I did that, it was being disobedient. And every time I got home, you know what I got. I got not a spanking, I got a whipping. So it was not easy for me growing up, and because of my temperament, which was not one of nonviolence, the Lord led me away from Birmingham. The crowning experience for me was one night when we were sitting on the front porch, my parents, my sister, and me, and this group of white youth would pass up and down the hill. We lived on Dynamite Hill, and they would flash lights in our face and call us names, ugly racial names, and hop back in the car and drive off, only to return again and again calling us names. Well, I knew where my dad kept his Colt 45 in the house, so I got up and I got it, and I came back out and sat on the front porch and waited for them to come back down the hill, and they did. And I stood up and I took aim and I fired. Fortunately, my dad saw me and he hit my arm, deflecting the shot in the air, and snatched the gun, whipped it from my hand, and said, "Helen, don't you know if you were to hit one of those boys, there would be nothing I could do to keep you from going to prison for the rest of your life?" Well, I cried because I didn't think it fair that the boys would do what they were doing, and I was not allowed to do what I wanted to do. But at any rate, they never returned it. I knew that night, I was 13 years old, I knew that night that I could not remain here in Birmingham. So I said, as soon as I was old enough to leave Birmingham, that I would leave, and that I would never, ever return to this city again. But what I learned through all of that is that, one, you should never say what you're never going to do. Because I've been back now for about 40 years. I finished, went off to college, moved to California, lived there for about 11 or 12 years before moving back to Birmingham. I can say now that I'm glad I moved back. I wasn't glad at the time that I moved back because it was not my idea to move back. It was my husband's idea to move back. So I had a choice to make, either stay out there by myself or move back to Birmingham with him and our children. So it wasn't too hard of a choice to make. I moved back with him and the children. And I can say today that I'm glad to be back.
As a lawyer who often practices in front of Judge Lee, let me make sure you understand something. She is not the kind of lady, for those of you old enough to remember an old Tony Joe White song called Poke Salad Annie. She is not the mean, straight, razor-toed kind of woman that he would sing about. She's just a wonderful judge. So despite firing shots into the air in her youth, she has changed. And I want to talk briefly because I think as I told Odessa, trying to explain the investigation and trials, 2 trials, that I was involved in for the bombing of this church in 10 to a minute is impossible. But I'm going to do my best. As you might can imagine, my background and upbringing is a far cry from what you just heard from Judge Clement and Judge Lee. I'm a little bit younger, not as much as I like to admit sometimes, but I am a little bit younger. And I grew up in Fairfield, the same city where Judge Clement got stopped by a police officer when he was a teenager. And it was a very segregated community, as was all the communities here. There was a white area of town, a black area of town. My community in Glen Oaks was a baby boomer suburb. It was like living in Ozzie and Harriet. And I didn't have the same kind of issues. When we would come to downtown Birmingham, which was really light years away in that time without interstates and those kind of things, I never faced the same kind of problems of when I came from a water fountain. I never faced the same kind of issues. I could go to Kitty Land anytime that I wanted to. It was a completely different world, and it was not until I was in junior high school and high school, and my schools were desegregated, that all of a sudden the world was changing, and as a kid, you adapt to those changes. And often, I think our children adapt a lot better than the adults did, particularly in Birmingham with all the changes that took place. For me, though, the defining moment was not just all that I did in high school and college to try to make sure that my student body and the people that I worked with and played with got along regardless of the color, came when I was in law school here in Birmingham at Stanford University Cumberland School of Law. I was a second-year law student, and I wanted to be a trial lawyer. And I was told one time by a great Supreme Court Justice, William O. Douglas, if you want to be a good trial lawyer, go watch great trials. And the first of the church bombing cases was actually tried in 1977. A young attorney general named Bill Baxley tried a fellow named Robert Chandler, who was affectionately known as Dynamite Bob, thought to be involved in so many of the bombings that Judge Lee talked about. And as a second-year law student, I cut classes to go watch that trial because I wanted to watch the argument and I wanted to watch history. And I never dreamed that 24 years later that this kid that was sitting in the balcony watching that trial and the emotion of those trials and the conviction of Robert Chandler would have a chance as the United States Attorney 24 years later to prosecute the same cases, to take up where Bill left off, to prosecute 2 individuals named Tommy Blanton and Bobby Frank Cherry for the bombing and murder of the 4 children here, and do it in the same courtroom where I watched as a kid. So my story, although different, takes an interesting twist and moves me in a place that I'm so happy to always be on panel with the folks that are on this panel. And we've done this before. I became the United States Attorney in September of 1997. By this time, the case had been reopened. And I won't go into all the details. There was a lot of controversy in the late 1980s and early 1990s between the black community here in Birmingham and the Justice Department. And as an effort to try to mend those fences, the case was reopened. Now, by the time it was reopened in 1996 or so, there had been some other cases that were opened in Mississippi, and there were convictions in Mississippi. Myron De La Beckwith was convicted of the murder of Medgar Evers in a case that was an offshoot from 2 trials that occurred in which De La Beckwith had been mistried for that murder in the 1960s. Sal Bowers was convicted for the murder of Vernon Damer, and all of a sudden, not only the communities, but law enforcement and prosecutors started saying, you know what, we can go back. We can take another look, that things are different now. Things have changed. Perhaps we can come up with some new evidence. And so these cases were really open about a month before I became the United States Attorney. And I will tell you, it was a chilling moment in my life to know that I'm about to become the United States Attorney, that my nomination is kind of working its way through. Armand de Kaiser's old boss, Senator Jeff Sessions, was helping out on that. And I knew that it was just a matter of about 3 to 4 weeks before I would become the U.S. Attorney when I walked out and I saw that this case had been reopened. And it was chill. I just sat down on the curb and I told my wife later, who wondered why I wanted to go back into public service, and she didn't know the history that I had with the case from the 1970s. And I told her, I said, here, look at this. And she said, that's wonderful. I hope they can get these guys. I said, no, you don't understand. This is why I want to be the U.S. Attorney. This is a case that this community has to do. This is a case that will define what we do as a people going forward, even if we don't think it. And so we took this case and we looked, and we had an incredible team. We had an incredible team of investigators and lawyers who just pursued these two cases, and wouldn't give up. We ultimately, even though I was the United States Attorney, and we investigated these cases in federal court with incredible support from the FBI and my boss, who was then Attorney General Janet Reno. I'm trying to confuse Louis Freeh and Janet Reno, and I'm going to get struck down by I can promise you, somewhere God is going to punish me. But Janet Reno was a huge supporter of this, but ultimately we couldn't make the case in federal court. We didn't have the jurisdiction, and there is no statute of limitation for murder in Alabama and probably in all of your states. So we moved the case over to state court, where a state grand jury indicted Blanton and Cherry. And candidly, I'm glad we did it, because I always believed it should always have been the state of Alabama that prosecuted these cases. I was a special deputy attorney general for the state. It should have always been the state of Alabama that prosecuted these guys. And the cases go down in history as the state of Alabama versus Tommy Blanton, and the state of Alabama versus Bobby Frank Cherry, because frankly it was the state of Alabama that let so many people down in the early 1960s and failed to prosecute this. Now let me quickly say, I don't think these cases could have been prosecuted successfully in the 1960s, despite an incredible effort by the FBI. They just couldn't put those things together. And I told my staff that this was going to be our last roundup. And to just kind of go quickly how we pull these cases together, it was really kind of remarkable. You can appreciate being with the Humanities. That trials are stories, they're theater. Trial lawyers are actors in one sense, and we have to tell these stories for the jury. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is and try to answer the question, why was this church targeted? Why were potentially these children targeted as victims of this crime? So we started looking not only at the case files, but at books, at history books, Pulitzer Prize-winning books like Taylor Branch's Parting the Waters and others. What we saw was that a lot of the violence, racial violence, stem from school desegregation orders. As if, the white community felt the world would come to an end if black kids went to school with black kids. And there was a lot of violence that stemmed from that. And in Birmingham, in 1957, the first piece of the puzzle comes into play when Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, one of the great leaders here, tries to enroll his children in an all-white high school in 1957, testing the Brown versus Boyd decision. And there was a mob of white people that beat him up, literally attacked him in front of that school, and it was caught on film by a young man, an 18-year-old who had gone back to school, who was working for a TV station and gone back to get his transcripts to go to college, and he caught on film. It's shown over there at the Civil Rights Institute. And what was interesting for us is that one of the people that was in the thick of that beat Fred Shuttlesworth up, was one of the defendants I would prosecute 40 years later, Bobby Frank Cherry. He had no kids that went to that school but felt compelled to violence. And so the school desegregation and the violence that accompanied it became a really important part of what we put together for our jury. But 1963 as a whole was important, because it was in the spring of 63 that the movement came to Birmingham, and it came right here into this church. As the children of Birmingham came, and Dr. King went to jail, Reverend Abernathy went to jail to desegregate the most segregated city in America. But it was the children who caught the eye of the world. When they met in this church and would leave here, they had emptied out the schools where people like Odessa were teaching and had to turn their back and let their children leave without permission. And they would leave this church and walk right into that street where you got off the buses and into that park and were met with bull hunters, fire hoses, and the dogs. It was kids, it was teenagers who were out there marching for freedom. And when the world saw that, they were appalled. And there were business leaders who decided that Birmingham had to change. And once that settlement was announced, very modest settlement in the marches, two really important things happened for us that we were able to show. Number one, this church and the children became symbols of the movement. As much as Dr. Dr. King, as much as Reverend Shuttlesworth, as much as Arthur Shores, this church was a symbol of a movement, and with that symbol becomes, you have a bullseye put on by the Klan. And the second thing was that the Klan was very unhappy. They were seeing their segregated way of life sliding away, and so there was more violence. Judge Lee talked about her home was bombed twice that summer. We had to stand in the schoolhouse door. And when George Wallace stepped away, the Klan became more violent. The March on Washington, all leading up to an important event in Birmingham in September, in August of that year, in which the schools were ordered to be desegregated by the federal courts. And Birmingham was like a powder. That order alone created an atmosphere of fear in the city. And 5 or 6 days after the schools were desegregated and the Armstrong boys walked into Green Line Elementary School, this church was bombed. A bomb that was placed right underneath the bottom step, from steps that led from the back of the sanctuary outside, right in front of a window into the basement where the ladies' lounge was. If you happen to get a chance to go downstairs, you're going to see a picture of this stained glass window here. And it was taken on the day of the bombing. And on that day, the most significant damage to that picture was the face of Christ, which you can imagine has incredible meaning. So now the die was cast for us, and we were putting this whole story together. When we ultimately indicted Cherry and Blanton, we really had 2 different cases. Blanton lived kind of like a hermit on his own. Cherry ran his mouth. You know, I like to say to people when ask me, because he lied all the time, and they asked me, how'd you know this was a lie? And I said, well, that was lips were moving, so I know it was a lie. And that's what we did. When we first opened the case, we went to interview Cherry. He admitted being part of the group that attacked Shuttlesworth, and we used a number of excerpts. He was still a racist at the time. But when after that interview, he did something really dumb. I don't know how many lawyers we got here. He did hire a lawyer, which is not the dumb thing to do, but his lawyer did a dumb thing and let him call a press conference. He really is the one that kind of announced that this investigation could be opened. And when the press conference was shown here and in Texas, where Cherry was living, the phone started ringing. One of the first people that called was Cherry's granddaughter, who said, thank God somebody's looking at this. Everybody knows. My granddad used to brag about it all the time on the front porch. She was the only person to help us. We found the ex-wife we didn't have any clue where she was. The FBI told me that they were looking for a lady who had married Cherry in the early 1970s, but they couldn't find her in 1997 and 98 when we were talking. Even, and I kept wondering why the modern FBI couldn't find a 75-year-old woman living in this country, not in an assumed name. She saw an article about our case in the newspaper and picked up the telephone. She saw the little hometown newspaper in Montana and picked up the newspaper and drove 200 miles to the FBI to tell her about the time about being married to Cherry and how his car broke down once near the church. And when she came to pick him up, he pointed to the spot in the church where he said they planted the bomb. And he talked about, on one hand, to show you the kind of people these guys were, he would say, the bomb didn't go off when it was supposed to. And in the very next breath, he would talk about these beautiful little girls who were killed as if they were animals and say, well, at least they can't breed. That's the kind of folks we were dealing with. So we had others that called us. A real important one, I think, is a fellow named Michael Gomes that called. He was working with Cherry in Texas in 1980, cleaning apartments. Cherry had a carpet cleaning business. And in a conversation that I think is probably the most significant for my cases and for the message that I'd like to tell individuals and people, I want to tell you the conversation. And this is the testimony, and I apologize for the language, but it's the testimony. He said they're talking about the rise of the Hispanic population in Dallas in 1980. And Cherry said, we just need to do to the wetback Mexicans like we did to the niggers in Birmingham. And he talked about bombing the church that killed those 4 little dear girls. And he bragged about it and all that he did. And that is, I think, an incredible lesson. The Blanton case was a lot different. Blanton didn't run his mouth. But 2 weeks before the bombing, there was a fellow who was named James Lay, who was a volunteer. They had to have a lot of volunteers to try to protect the homes of the civil rights leaders in the churches. And 2 weeks before the bombing, James Lay was riding by 16th Street at 1 o'clock in the morning, and he sees a car parked right outside those steps on the curb. And there's a man standing by the car, and there's another man standing by the steps, holding what Mr. Lake called a grip. It would have been a backpack, a gym bag. When he hits these bright lights, they run into the, and he looks around and they don't see anything. They take off. Call the Birmingham police. Birmingham police say, "Just going home, boy. You didn't see a damn thing." Boy was the name given to most black men, regardless of age, by the Birmingham police in those days. And 2 weeks later, when he hears the bomb, he comes and he helps bring out the bodies, and he gives Reverend Cross the bullhorn to kind of keep order as Reverend Cross preached the Sunday school lesson that was called "The Love That Forgives" that morning. And he tells the FBI what he saw. He picks out, he goes to show them pictures, and out of 100 or so pictures, he picks out 2. The man by the car that he saw, Dynamite Bob Chambers, and the man standing by the steps, Tony Blanton. Really strong circumstantial evidence that we have. The most significant evidence, and I won't go through all of it, we found it on tape recording. A tape recording made by one of J. Edgar Hoover's famous loves, made in the Blanton household after he was married to his Friday night girlfriend. And that tape, she had been his ally. Because in his first interview with the FBI, I couldn't remember where he was or what he did on that Saturday, Friday and Saturday night. He knew he went out with Gene, and he had him home by midnight. And then he went home and went to bed. But then when he was confronted, because we had a witness, I'm getting thugged here. We had a witness that puts his car at 2 o'clock in the morning with Chambers and others in the car. And when confronted with that, he climbs up, and Gene becomes his ally. But in this tape, Gene, who's now his wife, they're talking about that weekend, what they were doing. And he was asking her what the FBI said to her that weekend. And she said, "It's what you were doing that Friday night when you stood me up." And he wants to know 3 times. He says, "We were making a bomb. We were planning a bomb. Oh, I was making that bomb." Or the bomb. Which, despite all the bombings after September 15th, there was only one, the bomb. The final thing that I want to tell you, it was a remarkable tape recording, by the way, transcripts over at the Civil Rights Institute. Final thing was that history often forgets that there were actually 4 little girls in that ladies' lounge that morning. And 4 died and 1 survived. And the survivor was Sarah Collins Rudolph, Addie Mae Collins' sister. And she was the last witness. You start a case strong, you end it strong. And oh my Lord, I'll never end a case stronger than with Sarah Rudolph. We talked about coming to Sunday school in church that morning with her sisters. And as they were down in the ladies' room lounge getting ready. And as she walked over to the sink to wash her hands, she heard Denise McNair say something about her dress. And I asked her, I said, "Sarah, what did you do?" She said, "I turned around and looked in the room." Well, what happened? Well, then there was the explosion. And I put this picture up when I tell the story of this little black girl in the hospital with these large white patches over her eye. And she says, "I was buried underneath all the rubble, and I couldn't breathe, and I couldn't talk." I said, "What'd you do?" And I called for help. I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I called out for my sister. I called out, 'Addie, Addie, Addie.'" Her voice was rising in that courtroom like it did 37 years earlier. And I asked her if she ever saw her alive again. She said, "No, sir." And with that, I looked up at Judge Garrett, said, "Your Honor, the state rests its case." It took us about 2.5 hours to convict Blanton, about 6 to convict Cherry. A remarkable ending to a remarkable story. And I'm often asked, why did it take so long and how? Well, a couple of things real quick. One, climbed up. There had been a lot of bombings, but no one was hurt. It was difficult getting any information out. But more significantly, the lawyer, the defense lawyer in Blanton case, asked the same question. Why now? What has changed? And as I looked into the jury, and in the eyes of the jury in my rebuttal argument, I just simply said, the answer is very easy. We have changed. Look around you, look around the courtroom. We as a people have changed. Black and white, young and old, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics. We have changed as a people, and because of that, we were able to have jurors who walked into court without the biases, without the prejudices that they would have had in the 1960s, and viewed the evidence fairly. And thank God, put 2 old men in prison where they should have been some 50 years earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. thank you so much, Odessa and everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to Birmingham. Welcome to our scenic little burg. I hope you really get around and look at it because it's all here. Go drive around Dynamite Hill. I remember the first time I went there because growing up here over the mountain, on the right side of the tracks, and the wrong side of the revolution and the wrong side of history, I remember hearing about Dynamite Hill and assuming it was some, kind of slum and, this kind of terrible area. And I remember when I'd never gone there until I started working on my book in my late 20s. And I remember, being so amazed at how it was this sort of suburban development, which was, of course, the whole point. The reason it started getting bombed was that African Americans were confined to a very tiny, unacceptable residential area, and they were moving into nicer neighborhoods, and that's why it became Dynamite Hill. But apropos of what Doug said, I remember soon after Carry Me Home came out, I was asked to be the Martin Luther King Day speaker at the Unity Breakfast here on the King holiday in January. I knew that everybody, the one question on everybody's mind, on everybody's lips always is, how has Birmingham changed? And I remember, I knew I would be asked that a lot when I came back for this big breakfast. And I remember what I came up with finally, the way to capture it, because on one hand, of course, it had changed. We had apartheid back then, so just the fact that all those physical barriers had kind of come down was significant. But I remember the answer I finally came up with was, how has Birmingham changed? The whitest of the white girls growing up in Birmingham ends up being the Martin Luther King Day speaker in Birmingham. When I started talking about being a white girl after the book came out, it was almost as if I was Cro-Magnon man. I mean, even though I was talking to people who had experienced segregation, there had been this sort of veil of collective amnesia that had fallen over the white people who had gone through it. We did not really talk about it, even though a lot of the attitudes remained. And I remember, most of the understanding of segregation was that it was a bunch of haters, and we just saw them in terms of the cartoon villains like George Wallace or the Klan and the church bombers. But what I really wanted to write about, and what I spent a lot of time writing about, was how, and Odessa referred to this article I wrote in the New York Times that was published on the King holiday this year, about good and evil in Birmingham. What I really said was you can't look at it in terms of good and evil, you have to look at it in terms of good and normal. Because what we now look back on as this kind of form of mass social insanity was perfectly accepted to what we think of as good people. And I really wanted to kind of understand how I could grow up as this nice Christian girl, thinking that even white supremacists fit into that. How white was I? I mean, one of the things, I was alive during the church bombing, Odessa, but my most vivid memory of the spring of the fire hoses and police dog demonstrations was that To Kill a Mockingbird, the movie, had opened in Birmingham, and my friends and I made repeat returns to downtown to see matinees because our classmate Mary Badham had the starring role of Scout. And I never put that event together with the demonstrations until I started doing my research and read the coverage of the opening of this. But it was, the demonstrations had not registered in my consciousness at all. I finally, one of the things that motivated me to write about my own ignorance and the values of my community was that I couldn't understand how, when the church was bombed, the polite white people really distanced themselves from that event. And immediately, there were rumors that a car had been cited with out-of-state license plates. It was always the outside agitator, just like King was an outside agitator. That was what was pounded into us. Now, of course, he was an outside agitator, as I came to realize, and that's a good thing. And sometimes, throughout history, people need outsiders to come in and make them behave in their own interests. But we had been told that King had come to Birmingham to line his pockets just to raise money. Apropos of that, we had also been told that the church bombing had been an inside job, that it was bombed by blacks. White people actually thought the janitor had bombed the church. And again, the thinking was that black people were bombing their own churches, killing their own children in order to get publicity for the movement. So one of the things that I really wanted to work on was how the bombers had gotten away with it for so long. And because if they were such losers and such lunatic fringes as we all been led to believe, then how had they pulled it off? And so what I ended up spending, 18 years writing about, which was longer than Martin Luther King's career lasted, was trying to figure out, how this had happened. And what I learned was that it was very much tied up with the industrial history of Birmingham, including just the rampant use of bombs, because that was the tool of the coal industry. A policeman that I interviewed said to me, because I was saying, why couldn't you catch any of these people? Why couldn't you bring in cases against them? And he said, well, first of all, bombs destroy their own evidence. And also asking how these guys in Birmingham know how to make a bomb is like asking a farmer how he knows how to drive a tractor. So anyway, what I ended up discovering though was that not only were there the roots of Birmingham's racism was very much grounded in the industrial history, but also Bull Connor, the czar of City Hall who had been installed by those industrialists, had actively protected the church bomber for years. Robert Chan was the first one. So, so it turned out that these racial crimes really were tied to the polite society. I was really moved to hear James Baldwin wrote. So at the time, I had a Freudian reason for writing the book, which was to try to understand my father, because he was I shouldn't use the term black sheep, but I guess he was a rogue in his more civilized family, and I wanted to understand. I was afraid that he was a member of the Klan, but also I don't remember learning about the church being bombed, even though everybody my age totally remembers where they were and what they were doing when Kennedy was assassinated only 2 months later. And I just kind of wondered, why would something that had happened so close to me had not registered at the time? And I wanted, I really kind of wanted to understand that phenomenon. And, James Baldwin said, people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in me, and in them. And that history was somehow trapped in me. And I think I'm so happy that, I just want to say that this urge for us to forget all that and to try to deny and forget history, speaks to the core of your mission in the humanities. Because I'm sure we're all tired of hearing about STEM, right? And with all due respect to STEM, I don't think that, STEM is going to be around to interpret, record, preserve the history of the human race, which in the case of my narrative was the history of 2 races in this city. So one of the songs that you heard this morning was about God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. And James Baldwin published his famous essay in the New Yorker that was published in 1963 as his incredible book, The Fire Next Time, which title came from that spiritual. And I started seeing that line as the kind of frame of my book. No more water, because I thought of the fire hoses in the spring. And then the fire next time was the explosion here, where you're sitting. And without the humanities, that story would not have been told. So thank you for doing this, and and allowing me to be able to. Thank you for everyone on the panel for living the history, and then thank you for preserving a value in this society that allows us to value our own story.
Thank you. Every time I sit here, Diane, I remember the sound of the bombing as if it were now. Okay, so you have an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. I don't know how much time we have, Doug. How many minutes? Okay, we have about, the master has spoken, we have about 15 minutes. In order to use that wisely, two rules. One, you should get a mic. There's a roving mic. And the second thing is, if you would identify the person to whom you wish to address your question, and if indeed it is a question rather than a testimony or an exegesis, or your dissertation that you are now writing. Anyway, so if we do that, and if at the same time we hear it on the panel, we'll do likewise, we can hear from a lot of people. So hold your hand up, and there's the roving mic.
Yes, ma'am. Doug, yes. You had mentioned something about the role of the business community, that they had finally had enough and prompted some change. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, very, very briefly, when the Freedom Riders came through here in Birmingham in 1961, everybody knew they were coming, they knew exactly when they were going to arrive at the Greyhound bus station, and the Klan knew too, and they were there. One of their buses had been firebombed outside of Anniston, which is about an hour from here. But when the Freedom Rider buses rolled up, the only people at that bus station was the Klan. There was no police officers there. It was Mother's Day, 1961, and Bill Connor said his police officers were visiting their mothers. And so there were these photographs that got flashed around the world on the front page of every major newspaper in the country and around the world. Well, say the Birmingham News. It wasn't on the front page of the Birmingham News. There was a group of business leaders in I think it was Rotary. Was it Rotary or Kiwanis?
Rotary International.
Rotary International in Tokyo, and they saw the reaction of what was happening. And all of a sudden, these business leaders who were no friends of the movement knew that their city was going to die quickly. And they came back to Birmingham and said, we got to change things. And the first thing they did was to work with some great lawyers like Chuck Morgan and David Vann, the Young Turks, for a referendum to move the city away from a 3-member commission that included Bull Connor to a mayor-city council form of government. That election took place in the fall of 1962, right before the bombings. They passed. And in the spring, just before the marches took place, Birmingham re-elected its first mayor, and fortunately, the candidate who lost the mayoral runoff was Bull Connor. And then when the marches occurred here in Birmingham, and the photographs of the fire hoses and the dogs hit all around the world and around the country, they knew that just removing Bull Connor was not enough, that they had to do more. And they're the ones that secretly met with Dr. King to forge the very modest settlement to end the marches, things that would take down the white and colored signs, that would do away with Jim Crow laws, that would criminalize, make it punishable by going to prison for a black man and a white man to play checkers together in public. So the business community, although they were no friends of the movement necessarily, they certainly saw that this city had to progress and they had to do it, and that things were inevitable to make changes, and they were as much responsible as others for doing that.
Hi, yes. First of all, I just wanted to thank you and to the Alabama Council for organizing this wonderful panel. I just wanted to ask, and a number of us were on a civil rights tour yesterday here, and striking is how many people got away with murder and violence and were never prosecuted or got slapped on the wrist, basically. And I'm just wondering now, in terms of the spirit of reconciliation and feeling so much being in these places and people who have stayed living here, how people live with and what kind of reconciliation there is around folks who got away with things and still live in your community, and what's happening with that, if anything. And I'm not sure who to
Well, Judge, we'll ask Judge and then Helen.
Well, let me just say that my greatest fear is that we haven't learned enough from the movement, and that this country, we see now in this country, more racism than we've seen in a very long time. The election of Barack Obama brought out the worst in a lot of white folks, not just here in the South, but particularly in the South, and the rest of the nation. And in direct answer to your question, actually, there has been considerable reconciliation. The business community, in Birmingham particularly, in the last 2 years, has in a very remarkable way come to the aid of the school system. But I must point out that really that's nothing new. When I was a student at Miles College in '61, the business leaders in Birmingham were meeting with us as students and as President Pitts, telling us that if the city would rescind its segregation ordinances, they would allow their black patrons to be treated as their white patrons were treated. And to them, segregation didn't make good business sense. And they were in business to make money. And so we've had over the years, sometimes less, more recently, more of a reconciliation, I think, here in Birmingham than in a number of other places in the nation.
Judge Lee, and then we'll have the next question.
Racism is still very much alive here in the state of Alabama. I don't think there's anybody on this panel that would deny that we have made great strides over the last 50 years. But our task is not finished yet. If you look at the bill that the legislature passed maybe 2 years ago now, House Bill 59, Alabama passed the harshest immigration bill in the United States. And what message did that send our brown brothers and sisters? It was, get out of Alabama. We don't want you here. So in spite of all of the legislative victories and speeches, racism is still alive. And although the spirit, the Jim Crow laws are off the books now, but the spirit of Jim Crow is still very much alive and well. Through all of my years, I have learned that you can't bridle the hearts and minds of men, that only their actions, so to speak, can be managed, but not their hearts and not their minds. And until we learn to look at each other through the eyes of God, we will always look at each other with racism and fear.
Next question.
For Judge Clemens or Judge Lee, we seem to, when we're teaching history in the schools, and I thought about this yesterday when I was on the tour, we don't get to the 1960s very much. We talk about the assassination of JFK, we talk about Martin Luther King Jr., and I've just been incredibly moved by the stories that I've heard. So I would like to hear from you, what are one or two key things that you think we need to be teaching our kids so that they remember and understand the struggles that you went through and your counterparts and your families went through?
Well, I think that one of the things that is often overlooked is that it is because of the movement, particularly the Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that women have made considerable progress over the last half century. Much of that litigation, much of that progress came about as a result of litigation by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But the tremendous progress of women in the workplace, and to a lesser degree blacks, but certainly women, is directly attributable to the 1963 movement here in Birmingham. That was one of the primary aims of the demonstrations. Not just public accommodations, but jobs as well.
Judge Lee and also Diane.
Well, the movement of the 60s and the years leading up to the movement are as much a part of this country's history as anything else. We don't teach it in our school system here in Birmingham. When I was coming along, we taught what was called, I took Spanish American history and a variety of other history courses, and we took a course called Negro history, where you learn about your heritage and people that went before you. We don't do that now. We celebrate it once a month, February, Black History Month, and after that's over, we move on to the next event, Easter, I think it is. But we don't teach it in our schools. Our children don't know their history, and they don't know the part that people have played through that history to put them where they are today.
I ended up writing a children's history of the movement called A Dream of Freedom, partly because of the history that my daughters were learning in the New York City school system, and all they would learn about was Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. And I remember one of them brought home in second grade a scholastic newsletter on the King holiday that referred to Martin Luther King as someone who taught people that they could settle arguments without fighting, and they referred to the segregationists as people who disagreed with him, and I just went nuts. And again, it's sort of this amnesia that nobody was, and I said, oh yes, it was a fight, and so so this book has a lot about the white people in there as well, because see, this is what I was kind of referring to earlier about this amnesia, is that people really don't want to talk about what was normal in this country and what normal people did. And accepted and went along with. So anyway, so that's part of the problem, is that we still haven't been able to quite confront how deeply embedded we all were in this.
If I could just say one other thing, in terms of our history, I have found that many kids, and I do a lot of lectures and speeches around February Black History Month. They don't believe what really happened here. I have 16-year-old twins, and this book I wrote, The Gentle Giant of Dynamite Hill, which I've had to bust across their heads to get them to read it. They asked me, the question was, did you make that up, or did those things really happen? They don't believe that it really happened.
Yeah, Diane, also I wanted to mention something that has to do with this group in relationship to that subject. As a retired teacher and still teaching informally and working with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and other organizations, I'm finding that through grants from the Humanities, and I'm pandering, grants shamelessly. Grants from the humanities to organizations like the ones that you visited yesterday help in having informal ways of working with teachers who themselves, after all, don't know the story. And we were talking about 50 or more years from now in the past. So I think what you are doing and what schools are doing, we have to keep saying, we have to validate. Those of you who have a microphone and a voice have to validate the importance of the stories that these folks are telling and help write them and help distribute them even in tweets. Another one?
Can I add one thing? I know that when I tell children's, young audiences that people cheered, white children around the city of Birmingham cheered when Kennedy was assassinated, they will not believe me. And I have to say, I was there, I heard it. The other, yeah, so.
We are coming, let's see, I can hog the mic. We are coming to that assassination. Let me give you one story. I think you mentioned that I was a young school teacher that year in 1963. I remember very well when Kennedy was killed. The kids came in, they heard it out on lunchtime on a transistor radio. They came in the classroom, they're falling out, just, really in shock and sadness. And at the same time, a carload of roughnecks pass our school chanting, "The nigger lover is dead." So that I remember that too. Anyway, back to you.
Real quick one, Judge Clement, you said that you weren't arrested early on, and you referenced the fact that you were going to be a lawyer. I didn't really understand how you avoided being arrested.
By the grace of God. I made a conscious decision to participate in the demonstrations, even though I recognized that after I finished law school and applied to take the bar examination, I was going to be subjected to the Committee on Character and Fitness. And I was prepared to run that risk. And one who is more powerful than all of us decided that he wouldn't subject me to the risk. And so instead of being taken to a jail from the Birmingham Public Library, I came back to this church. Or taken to jail from Pizitz, marching, I came back to this church. And I have no other explanation for it.
Can I say one? As you leave, I know we're winding up here. If you haven't had a chance, I would invite you to walk Haddon Corner across the street to see the memorial that was just recently dedicated to the 4 girls who died in this church. There's a bronze statue of each of them. And if you look, the statues of Addie Mae Collins and Denise McNair depict the last scene that I described for you in the trial, where Addie Mae is tying the sash of Denise's new dress as Denise releases doves, 6 doves, representing the spirits of 4 children who died in the church, and 2 young men who died later in the afternoon that often history completely overlooks. A young man who was riding on the bike of his brother was shot by a teenager who had just come from a Klan meeting, and then another young man was shot in the back, unarmed, in the back by the police after a disturbance here. So please take a look at it. It's a beautiful work of art.
Gwen.
Please join me in thanking not only our panel, but our moderator.